Welcome back. As you can see from this is one of my pictures of the rocks. I took rocks I was sampling in Antarctica, and this is where we get into slightly more Antarctica-specific material. This we will be talking. Essentially giving a brief overview of geologic and paleontology time. Also, I'm going to give you kind of the highlights of what has happened to Antarctica throughout its history, throughout its pre-human history, that is. This is very much a skimming. There is some material in here that I am happy to talk with you more about and that I know a lot more about. Other cases, not so much, partially because we don't know that much about it, because quite frankly, there is not a lot of exposed rock in Antarctica, and you need exposed rock to find fossils, or really to make any sense geologically. But it's pretty impressive what scientists have managed to reconstruct with the small amount of rock that is exposed in Antarctica, as well as with clues from related continents, in a sense, now that we know that Antarctica has a long history of being attached to most of the other southern hemisphere continents. So returning to the concept of geologic time begins with the Precambrian. And Precambrian time is actually not strictly an eon, an era, a period, or an epoch. It's not really an interval of time. It's a catch-all. It refers to everything before the Cambrian Explosion. And the funny thing is that it actually occupies most of Earth's known history, from 4.5 billion years, when Earth was formed, until 540 million years ago, when most life as we know it appeared. And there is very little left from Precambrian time. We have some of the oldest rocks on Earth found at the depths of the North American continent and the Antarctic continent and others as well. And in fact, the Grand Canyon serves a really wonderful purpose in exposing some of these ancient and very heavily metamorphosed rocks from Precambrian time. And the fact that they're so heavily metamorphosed is one reason why we don't have a lot of fossils left. But there's also the fact that there really wasn't very much life on Earth to begin with. In fact, there was no life to start out with. Life took quite a while to even show up because Earth was inhospitable to any life, and then for a long time there was nothing living on Earth besides extremophiles. At the very end of what we consider Precambrian time, we have a few little weird fossils like these Ediacara Biota, but Precambrian time is really time before recognizable plants, animals, and organisms showed up, which is a little bit arbitrary in a sense, but there was such a pronounced radiation of evolution at the start of the Cambrian that it makes sense to define that. And this is what I mean when I say that intervals of time are defined by the rocks and the fossils found in them and not the other way around, something we'll come back to when I talk about mass extinctions. And the oldest rocks in Antarctica are not as old as the age of the Earth, but they have found rocks as old as 3.8 billion years. They're in Enderby Land, which is over here. That's the part of Antarctica that's south of Africa. And there is some exposed rock over there near the coast. You can actually see that there are scatterings of ice-free areas all over Antarctica, mostly near the coasts, in the dry valleys, and on the peninsula. But there are just broad swathes of the continent that are covered by so much ice that we have very little real hope of knowing what's underneath there. And this really has inhibited us understanding what the full understanding of what has lived on Antarctica. For example, we know that dinosaurs lived in Antarctica, but we only have a couple of described species. We only have a few dinosaur specimens, and there's probably more hidden under the ice. But there are actually some things we can do even with the ice cover being present. So geologists have discovered that East Antarctica is a craton, and a craton is a massive continent that has been together since Precambrian time. It's essentially one of the original continents in that Earth was actually originally mostly just oceanic crust, and plate tectonics formed some early chunks of continental crust that more bits were added onto. And so most of the continent building actually occurred during Precambrian time. There is still continent building going on today, still mountain building, but the continents were built during Precambrian time, and Antarctica is no exception. East Antarctica has been geologically stable since essentially the end of Precambrian time, since the Cambrian Explosion. And something interesting is that this means that we have really thick crust underneath East Antarctica. It's ancient. it hasn't gone anywhere. It hasn't subducted. Sediments have piled up for years. Rocks have been metamorphosed. So the crust is really thick. And that actually means that it pushes into the asthenosphere more. We don't just, and this is where isostasy comes back. Antarctica, as it turns out, is on two fronts a very heavy continent, because not only do we have ice covering it and physically weighing the plate that Antarctica is sitting on down more into the asthenosphere, but the actual lithosphere making up the Antarctic plate is really thick, especially in East Antarctica. How do we do this? We use earthquake waves. We have been able to, earthquake waves travel differently through different types of rock and through different crustal thicknesses, and they've been able to measure how fast earthquake energy travels through East Antarctica and have been able to determine that it is a big, thick mass of crust. And Antarctica's oldest rocks are part of this craton. They're found in East Antarctica in Enderby Land, and they were formed as a result of one of these continent building episodes, orogenies, as you'd call them. East Antarctica was actually built by a series of these events. If you look closely at this upper leftmost diagram, you can see there's a little bit of cross-stitching here, and that is Enderby Land. That is showing you where the oldest rocks are, because that is the first known continental crust from Antarctica. And what scientists have reconstructed is that this is something you'll learn more about if you take Earth 2, but what happened is that smaller bits of crust would be rafted towards the larger bits of crust, and that would cause subduction. Subduction makes volcanoes, and that makes more crust. When the two bits of land got close enough, we had a Himalayan type situation happening. The volcanism would come to an end. Any ocean sediments between them would just get caught up and shoved up, and that's what's happened in the Himalaya. We have ocean sediments found on top of Mount Everest for that very reason. And you would get mountain building. You would get high mountains forming. Not quite as dramatic as the Himalaya necessarily, but still. And you don't need to memorize all of these, but you do need to know that a sequence of orogenies built the Antarctic craton. Antarctica was built over the Precambrian period, over Precambrian time, by a sequence of these different mountain building events. And most of this was done by the Cambrian period, by the Cambrian Explosion, by the point in time where we really start considering the fossil record much. And this is why we consider Antarctica to be a craton, because this happened very early on in Earth's history. This also happened with North America. North America was similarly built by a series of stackings of small bits of crust stuck to larger bits of crust by plate tectonics and subduction until you had a larger mass form. And something interesting about Antarctica is that I've alluded to the fact that it's not always physically been at the latitude where it is now, aka the South Pole. And it's been close to the South Pole for a long time, but if you go way back in time, if you go to around about 1 billion years. So now we're actually getting to the end of the Precambrian time. And yes, I have skimmed over a lot of it because we don't know very much about it, quite frankly. But by the time all of these orogenies had mostly come to an end, you had East Antarctica as an established continent. By close to the end of Precambrian time, Antarctica is believed to have been part of a supercontinent, an assemblage of the other continents all put together, or most of them at least. And you might have heard the supercontinent term used for Pangaea before. This is the original Pangaea. This is the supercontinent that existed before Pangaea. As it turns out, the continents cyclically go from being close together in a supercontinent to spreading out again, like we have today. And that's actually called the Wilson cycle, if you want to know the term for it. But we have figured this out by looking at rock structures the same way that people looked at rock structures on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. And scientists discovered that the rocks in East Antarctica were almost identical to correlated age-wise, like rocks that were the same age in southwestern North America, even though Arizona is nowhere near McMurdo Base nowadays. And combined with analyses of the magnetic signatures of the rocks, aka looking at the little flecks of iron and seeing seeing what that tells us about what latitude those rocks would have been at. The best hypothesis seems to be that Antarctica was actually in the northern hemisphere, pretty darn close to the equator, and that right on the equator was Laurentia, which is most of North America, and that southwestern North America was attached to East Antarctica. This is the sweat hypothesis because of the joining of SW, southwestern North America, and EAT, East Antarctica. And this joining occurred when Rodinia existed, when Rodinia was a supercontinent. And Rodinia would fall apart before Pangaea. Pangaea would essentially be the next iteration of supercontinent cycles. Why does it happen this way? It has something to do with spreading centers and subduction and their relative rates. Ask a geophysicist for more details on that one. Life originated near the end of Precambrian time, and whatever early life existed was microscopic, single-celled, and lived only in the oceans. Because Earth's early environment was a harsh place. There was, in fact, little to no free oxygen for anything to breathe. There was also no ozone layer. So that meant that there was increased ultraviolet radiation, and that's a big reason why life originated in the oceans, actually, because the oceans provide a measure of protection from ultraviolet light, and it was an easier place for early life to evolve. So the very earliest life forms would have looked like the bacteria and archaea that we consider to be extremophiles today. The microorganisms that live in hot springs and these black smokers, as well as in some extreme environments in Antarctica. This is Blood Falls, which is an example where there is a really unique ecosystem trapped under this lake, and the bacteria are oxidizing iron, and the water flows out just at one site, and you get this blood red water flowing out. It's not blood, it's just got iron in it. That's actually why blood is red, actually. It's from the iron in the hemoglobin. But the earliest life forms would have looked very similar to those extremophiles. And the reason is that these extremophiles often survive in environments where there is little or no free oxygen. They do what's called anaerobic respiration because they make food but without oxygen. And complex life, like me, my kitty, the plants, are all descended from microorganisms that lacked these abilities. So that's why we can't survive this. And in fact, it generally seems like you won't get much more than single-celled life under really extreme conditions. So there's a good chance we could find alien life if spaceships got far out enough. It's just a good chance that that alien life would be little microorganisms and not really that different from the bacteria we have here. One particularly consequential group of these microorganisms are cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae. And they are one of the few groups that can do photosynthesis, the chemical process of using sunlight to make sugars. The earliest evidence of the atmosphere getting any oxygen comes around 2.4 billion years ago. And that tells us that cyanobacteria were present in significant numbers by that point to produce oxygen, because photosynthesis ultimately is what produces oxygen. And you had to have some some microorganisms photosynthesizing enough before there was enough free oxygen for more complex life to survive. So cyanobacteria released more and more free oxygen in the air until there was more air for us and other more complex organisms to perform aerobic cell respiration, when you use oxygen to make food, essentially. And the interesting thing is that plants rely on cyanobacteria. Plants photosynthesize via these little things called chloroplasts. They're called an organelle because they're a little component inside of a plant cell. And they appear to be their own living organisms, actually. They appear to be cyanobacteria that live inside of the plant cells and divide with them and exist symbiotically. And this theory is called the endosymbiosis theory, that in deep geologic time, you had two bacteria and one of them engulfed the other. And instead of destroying the bacteria and instead of destroying what it had eaten, the other bacteria somehow found a way to use it, found a way to obtain the food photosynthesized by the chloroplast, by the cyanobacteria. Um, Mitochondria, which are the organelles that help process energy, essentially, are believed to have originated from a similar process. So the common ancestor to all plants must have done this. It appears to have happened a couple times independently, actually, because there's differences. Well, anyway, the ancestor. I will say that with plants, the common ancestor of all true plants must have done this. Must be descended from an organism that had this relationship. Because plants cannot do this without chloroplasts, and all plants have chloroplasts. I will say that when I say plants, I don't necessarily mean all types of algae. It turns out that red algae and green algae are really different from another, and cyanobacteria are often referred to as blue-green algae, even though they're single-celled and they're not really like seaweed. This is just me getting off on a point about life being more complex than people realize a lot of the time. But you're going to ask, how do we know that cyanobacteria were even doing this, and how can we make that connection? We got lucky because cyanobacteria leave a trace fossil behind. They leave something called a stromatolite behind, and when a layer of cyanobacteria grows, if it is not disturbed by predators, it will trap sand. And as more cyanobacteria grow on top, sand will get trapped inside of the layers. Now, the cyanobacteria mats themselves will decay, but the sand preserves pretty well. And the sand preserves into these layers that show growth layers, essentially, of cyanobacteria. We know this is the case because we still have stromatolites today. We get stromatolites in places where there are not a lot of predators, like Shark Bay, Australia, and Lake Untersee, Antarctica. The cool thing about this Lake Untersee one is that you have these cone stromatolites, which isn't something that was known that any modern stromatolites were observed to do until recently. But there's not a lot of predators in this lake. It's in Antarctica. It's a pretty extreme environment, but the cyanobacteria can do fine. And this is also, Shark Bay, Australia is also an extreme environment. Shark Bay, Australia is really salty. It's saltier than normal ocean water, and fish cannot survive it generally. So the stromatolites we have today survive in these extreme environments, and the stromatolites are found everywhere in the early fossil record because cyanobacteria evolved and formed these structures before there were any animals around to prey on them. And it's really interesting how we got lucky in this regard. We have a similar structure forming today, and we were able to make that connection between the living stromatolites we have in extreme environments today and the fossil stromatolites we find in the rock record. One of the consequences of cyanobacteria and their efforts to oxygenate the atmosphere was iron, was rust, essentially. Meow, meow. Okay, you're not allowed in here. Sorry. Our evidence for how we know when oxygen even became available has to do with iron in the rocks. Iron itself is soluble in water, but iron often forms an oxide, Fe2O3, which you may know as rust. And that does not easily dissolve in water. So what happened when oxygen became available in Earth's atmosphere? It began to make its way into the oceans, and when enough oxygen was present in the oceans, that caused the iron to oxygenate, and that iron then stopped being dissolved in the water and fell out and settled on the bottom. So the ocean sediments were then full of iron oxide. So this happened when cyanobacteria first started releasing oxygen. The rapid oxygenation of the ocean would cause iron to simply fall out to the ocean floor, and then the oxygen would be used up, and you would go from having a period where the seafloor sediments were covered in red to where they were normal again, where they were a normal gray color. But then cyanobacteria, which were still alive, would continue to produce oxygen until enough oxygen accumulated for there to be more iron falling out. And so you actually get these alternating gray and red bands of seafloor sediment. Red from when there was a lot of oxygen and that was causing the iron to fall out, and gray from when the oxygen had been depleted again and when there wasn't any oxygenation happening. This eventually stopped. Eventually, most of the iron simply was used up, and it was able to form an equilibrium. And 1.8 billion years is about when this stops. Most of the banded iron formations are found between 2.5 billion years and 1.8 billion years. And they are indeed found in Antarctica. They're found all over the world, which is why this is often known as the Great Oxidation Event, because this happened worldwide in the world's oceans. It's kind of misleading to describe it as an event, because it's more like events, like it was a sequence of oxygenation episodes that eventually accumulated in Earth's oceans and atmosphere, becoming oxygenated to the point where more complex life could form. And even after the Great Oxygenation Event, there still was not that much free oxygen. More free oxygen would come to be as more complex algae and plants evolved. But even with the new oxygen, there still wasn't that much of it. And this meant that the Precambrian life we have is mostly not very complex, but we also don't have a great record of it. The small handful of complex organisms that would develop, we have evidence of their burrows, a couple of embryos, some broken shells, and then we have these guys. They're known as the Ediacara Biota. They're named after actually the final period of the Precambrian, so they show up at the very, very end of Precambrian time. And this artist's impression makes them look like jellyfish and sea slugs and sea pens, but the thing is, they only vaguely really look like that, and we can't confidently say that any of these are jellyfish or any of these really closely resemble anything that's actually alive today. They may not even be animals. They've been hypothesized to be lichens, although that's quite controversial. So Antarctica's fossil record is even more dismal, unfortunately. These Ediacara biota are mostly known from Australia, actually. So we have a pretty good idea that they were present in Antarctica because Australia and Antarctica are so well associated, but we haven't found them in Antarctica, mostly probably just because they're buried under ice, quite frankly. I would bet money that you would be able to find some of these fossils somewhere in Antarctica in a place that's covered under ice, but they have yet to be found there. But something else interesting that happens near the very end of the Precambrian. So notice that we've gone from giga-annum, or billions of years, to mega-annum, millions of years, or MA. So around 650 million years ago, we have essentially the first ice age. Remember how I talked about how scientists found glacial deposits at equatorial latitudes, and that indicated that that land had once been at a more polar latitude? I also have mentioned that you have to consider how climate might have changed. And scientists were stumped when they found evidence of glaciers. They found drop stones and smooth surfaces and glacial flour. And they looked at where the rocks had been latitude-wise, and they discovered that they had indeed been near the equator, that there had been glaciers at the equator, at sea level, at some point in Earth's history. After scientists dramatically amped up their search for more evidence to try to disprove this, they actually found even more evidence that around 650 million years ago, glaciers covered the entire Earth, including the oceans. This is Snowball Earth. Snowball Earth appears to have occurred as a result of a really extreme example of runaway albedo. Earth appears to have become glaciated in the first place through a combination of plate tectonics as well as Earth's orbit. I mentioned Milankovitch cycles and how that affects how Earth's orbit is shaped around the sun, and that has a long-term effect on climate. But we actually don't have a 100% accurate idea of how Snowball Earth happened still. For one thing, it's a pretty extreme occurrence, and so it's hard to really compare that to any other instances. It's the only known instance in Earth's history where the entire planet actually became like the Star Wars planet Hoth, like The Empire Strikes Back, where there were glaciers covering almost the entire planet. It was a much more extreme ice age. And it also lasted longer. The Earth there was so much ice on Earth that it was reflecting away so much radiation that Earth just kept getting colder and colder. However, plate tectonics did not cease. And plate tectonics, as we'll talk about when we talk about climate change, have quite a bit of an interesting effect with climate, in that volcanoes release CO2 and subduction actually sequesters CO2 by trapping ocean sediments full of calcium carbonate. But a period of increased subduction and volcanism began. More volcanoes meant more CO2, and eventually enough CO2 accumulated in the atmosphere from this increased volcanism that brought an end to Snowball Earth. The greenhouse effect actually brought an end to Snowball Earth, and it's evidence of the fact that the greenhouse effect plays an important role in stopping this from happening, or at least eventually stopping this from completely running out of control. I believe that a Snowball Earth event is much less likely because carbon dioxide levels have been so much more stable overall. Even if you consider that we've had ice ages, none of them have been as extreme as this. But there's still a lot we don't know about this because, again, we still have a very poor record of what even existed 650 million years ago. And it's remarkable that we can find that these glaciers existed at all. That brings us past the Precambrian. Goodbye, Precambrian time. Honestly, we hardly know ye. But the Cambrian Explosion is really where it all began. And some people think actually that the Cambrian Explosion might have been initiated by a proliferation of life after Snowball Earth. But in any case, in a very rapid amount of time, all of the major groups of animals showed up. Arthropods, mollusks, the various types of worms, jellyfish, and even the ancestors of fish. And the crucial thing was that first, we can recognize these fossils. We can say this looks like a sea centipede of some type. That's Anomalocaris, and it is indeed an arthropod. This over here is Pikaia, which is one of our ancestors. We can look at these fossils, at their shape, at their body shapes, and make educated guesses about what they're related to. The other thing is that we actually start having lots of shelled organisms again. We have arthropod shells, and we have clam shells, and we have a lot more groups of animals that produce hard parts. Although I will say that one really remarkable thing about the Cambrian Explosion is that one of the best records of it comes from the Burgess Shale of Canada, where the animals are so well preserved that you can see their soft parts. So we have very heavily relied on one particularly well-preserved assemblage of fossils, that found in the Burgess Shale. And the Burgess Shale assemblage of fossils is really, really cool. Now, so this happened in Antarctica too. They have found these same organisms, and by the Cambrian period, the Earth had warmed down a lot from Snowball Earth, and Antarctica was covered by warm, shallow water. So you have limestone forming. You have a type of rock forming that doesn't form in cold water, and you also have evidence of animals that clearly would have been happier living in warm water. Around the same time as the Cambrian Explosion was happening, was sort of a late happening mountain building event that was actually the topic of my research. And I bring this up not because it's particularly important in the grand scheme of things, but because it does show that mountain building events did occur periodically and could occur again if Antarctica were to, say, I don't know, if Madagascar were somehow to end up on a collision course with Antarctica. That's very hypothetical. But by the time that the rocks that I was studying were deposited, Rodinia was gone. This was actually Antarctica was now part of Gondwana land, a sort of a supercontinent that consisted of all the southern continents. And there was a subduction arc off the coast of Antarctica that produced volcanism in what is now East Antarctica. And that also caused some small little bits of crust to be rafted to and attached to Antarctica. So you had continental collision and subduction, which you don't have now. And that's what I was studying. I was studying a convergent plate boundary that no longer exists. We have evidence of it from the rocks, from the volcanic rocks, as well as from the metamorphosed ocean sediments that got caught up between the colliding continents. But that's not happening today. Antarctica today is a passive margin, and the nearest plate boundaries are the spreading centers way out in the ocean. Something that I had to be careful about was that when doing geology, you're presented with evidence from multiple times, often just right in front of you. And so my rocks, these lampripheres from the Ross orogeny that I was studying, are these little stripes down by the lake, and they cut across brown granite from earlier in the orogeny. Look up here on top of the mountains. You see this black rock? It looks kind of like it might also be a lampriphere. Nope, that is actually that's basalt from a rifting episode. That is from much later on, the rifting of Antarctica from Africa. And that's something to think about. You see that that's higher up. That's from an event that occurred more recently. That occurred in the Jurassic period some 100-something million years ago versus the Ross orogeny, which occurred 500 million years ago. The older event is represented by rocks that are on the bottom. The valley has just been eroded by glaciers and wind since the erosion happened after all of these rocks were intruded. Now, I mentioned Gondwana. Gondwana is a term you want to be familiar with because Gondwana is what Antarctica was attached to until very recently. Gondwana existed after Rodinia broke up, and then it would later combine with the northern continents to form Pangaea. Confusingly, again, when Pangaea broke up in the Jurassic period, Gondwana is again used to refer to the southern continents. So Gondwana is basically when the southern continents are altogether separate from the northern continents. So South America, Africa, the Indian subcontinent, Antarctica. What's left of Zealandia, which is actually New Zealand, is all that is left of a now mostly submerged continent that actually goes all the way to New Caledonia. The island of New Caledonia is another remnant of Zealandia. But New Zealand was attached to Antarctica until pretty recently also. And all of these continents have a close association, and they have similar fossils, similar rock types, similar structures, and that's how we've come to this conclusion that they were attached. We've looked at the similarities in the rocks and the fossils we find in these different places and drawn that conclusion from that. And the more fossils we get, the easier this becomes, because once we had a lot of shallow ocean fossils, we could start seeing where there was an ocean. Really, though, we had to have a lot of land fossils before we could start making great conclusions about where the continents were, because ocean life can distribute more. Ocean stuff in the ocean can get to another ocean without that much trouble. Once you have organisms living on the continents, they're going to stay on the continents, and it's not that plausible that you're going to have, and it's very rare that you're going to have cross-continental migration. Some exceptions: we have cattle egrets crossing the Atlantic Ocean today. Those white birds that you sometimes see by cattle actually followed cattle over the Atlantic Ocean when they were introduced, but usually things stay on their own continent. And one point there is that the land was not colonized until pretty recently. Land plants showed up after the Cambrian Explosion, and animals followed them afterwards. We didn't really have much in the way of forests or widespread plant coverage until what is known as the Carboniferous Period. The Carboniferous Period is named actually for carbon because the Carboniferous Period is when most coal was formed. The first plants to form forests were not flowering plants. They were conifers, as well as tree ferns and club mosses and horsetails. It would have looked at least somewhat similar to this tree fern forest we have in New Zealand, albeit with more horsetails and no flowering plants whatsoever, because those had not evolved yet. Now, essentially, the land, Earth was quite warm during the Carboniferous. It was ripe for swamps to cover much of the land, for these steamy jungles, essentially, to cover much of the land. Now, what happened in these steamy jungles was that there was so much vegetation accumulating that the bottom vegetation would get compressed and it would get buried before it became decayed, kind of like a fossil. That is actually kind of where the term fossil fuel comes from. Fossil fuels they're formed from ancient life that was fossilized, buried before it could be destroyed. It just also happens to be useful as energy. There's a lot of carbon in coal. Oil is the same deal with ocean plants. Oil forms from dead ocean organisms. But Antarctica was just covered in these steamy, wet coal swamps. And we can still find evidence of it. We can still find fossil trees sticking out of the ground in this area that otherwise has no plant life whatsoever. And we have also found coal in Antarctica. There are coal deposits found throughout the Transantarctic Mountains that formed from the plants in these swamps. And happily, they cannot be extracted. The Antarctic Treaty specifically specifies that that there is no mineral or coal extraction on the Antarctic continent until the treaty expires. So this coal is just going to keep sitting there at least until the treaty expires. The Carboniferous period was the second to last period within what we call the Paleozoic era. The Paleozoic era starts with the Cambrian Explosion and ends with the Permian Extinction. It begins with the proliferation of life, and it ends with an episode that saw a large proportion of life go extinct. So the Permian period that gives its name to the Permian Extinction is the final period of the Paleozoic era, and it was actually the first period of time when there was a lot in the way of land animals. It's the first period of time in which we have a dominant land fauna. And the interesting thing is that the dominant land fauna was not dinosaurs then. This fun creature here is Dimetrodon, which is the sail-backed dinosaur that you might often see in sets of dinosaurs, but it is actually much more closely related to us. It's a synapsid, and synapsids are essentially a sister group to reptiles, and they include us, all mammals, and our ancestors. So the funny thing is that in the Permian period, before the dinosaurs even evolved, the most successful and the first land animals to really dominate were synapsids, were mammal ancestors. And something interesting about this was that this was when Pangaea had formed. Pangaea, essentially all of Earth's land mass was attached. And this seems to have contributed somewhat to an ice sheet forming. Remember the continental effect. You will get big ice sheets forming if you have large masses close to the South Pole. By this time, Antarctica was actually pretty close to the South Pole. And several times during the Permian period, there were periods of glaciation. There were ice sheets that formed over Antarctica as well as other southern continents. And it's one reason why we actually don't have a lot of fossils from Antarctica from this time, because like today, it was covered in ice. So today's ice age is not the first time Antarctica has been covered in ice. It was covered in ice during Snowball Earth and also during the Permian period. But still, Earth was not completely covered in ice during the Permian, and we had synapsids as well as in the parts of Antarctica that weren't covered in ice, we do have evidence of a fossil plant called Glossopteris, which was a seed fern. A fern, it's an extinct relative of ferns that produce seeds rather than spores. They are extinct now, and there is some hypothesis that they're related to flowering plants. But in any case, this one plant genus, Glossopteris, was ubiquitous across the southern hemisphere. And you might remember that it was actually, you might remember that on the continental drift diagram, there was a plant fossil in there. That's what this plant was. This plant fossil has been found in Antarctica, in Australia, in India, in South America, and it gives a clear picture that the southern continents were joined, including during the Permian period. All good things must come to an end, however, including this first would have been age of mammals. Because hypothetically, if the Permian extinction had never happened, synapsids might have continued to diversify, and who knows what they would have evolved into, but dinosaurs might never have really dominated at all. As it turns out, dinosaurs became dominant during the period after the Permian, after a mass extinction wiped out most of Earth's life. So what is a mass extinction? Well, species are always going extinct, and that's what we call background extinction. But normally, new species evolve just about as quickly to replace them. A mass extinction is when the fossil record indicates that a huge number of organisms went extinct and were not quickly replaced. This usually indicates a cataclysm, like a global cataclysm. So the most famous one is the extinction that wiped out the vast majority of dinosaurs, and that is now generally agreed to have been from a devastating asteroid impact. But sometimes rapid climate changes or volcanic eruptions have caused mass extinctions, and if I'm going to be honest, the sheer amount of biodiversity being lost right now is being lost because one species is dominating at the expense of others, humans. So we are in the first example of a single species actually causing a mass extinction. So that's cheering stuff for thought. But that's why the present time is often referred to as the sixth great extinction, because the first occurred during an ice age that we're not going to talk. The first two occurred during ice ages that we're not going to talk very much about. The third is the Permian extinction. The fourth is the dinosaur extinction, and the fifth The third is the Permian extinction. The fourth is an extinction at the end of the Triassic that didn't kill dinosaurs, but killed a lot of other reptiles that had been competing with dinosaurs. And then the fifth is the dinosaur extinction. Now, before the dinosaurs even evolved, there was another mass extinction that wiped out the vast majority of life, essentially. The Permian extinction wiped out 96% of all marine genera and about 3/4 of everything that lived on the land. So some species survived, but not that many, and Earth was kind of devastated after this. Actually, one funny thing about the fossil record is that you often find stromatolites, those structures built by blue-green algae, right after a mass extinction because there were fewer predators, fewer snails, fewer things to feed on the cyanobacteria. So stromatolites exist for a couple million years after a mass extinction. It's kind of spooky. But the Permian extinction does not appear to have been caused by an asteroid. Once people figured out that was the case with the dinosaur extinction, people looked for one. The funny thing about the Permian extinction is that the best hypothesis for what caused it seems kind of like a science fiction movie. Remember the Carboniferous Period and all the coal swamps? By the end of the Permian, that was all coal. It had all solidified into coal. Well, at the end of the Permian, plate tectonics caused a massive episode of volcanism to begin in what is now Siberia. The Siberian traps refer to lava flows that cover a big chunk of middle Siberia, and this was the sheer amount of lava released during these massive eruptions. So the lava is going to cause damage, but what really caused damage was carbon dioxide. The lots of volcanism released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But something else happened. The lava flows ignited coal that was lying underneath here. So not only was there carbon dioxide coming from the volcano, from the vent, there was carbon dioxide coming from the lava igniting the coal, the same way that we intentionally burn coal today. This sounds ridiculous, but scientists tracked where the coal deposits were and where the Siberian traps were and calculated how much CO2 could have been released, and it was devastating. The oceans would have become unsurvivably acidic. And this actually does a good explanation as to why the oceans were so heavily affected. Because, as we'll learn about later, too much CO2 in the atmosphere causes the oceans to acidify. And if the oceans acidify, ocean life will die. And on land, even though some of the synapsids did survive, as we know mammals exist today, they declined very heavily. And this would lead the stage open for dinosaurs to dominate. So the next class we'll pick up with dinosaurs. We'll start with dinosaurs, continue into the dinosaur extinction and Antarctica as it approaches the present, and then we'll end with talking about the little terrestrial life that still does exist in Antarctica, kind of capping our life history of Antarctica. I do apologize for getting this released on the late side. Today's been a little bit of a hectic day, but let me know if you have questions, and I look forward to talking more about this stuff next on Wednesday because I really like talking about this stuff. I love fossils.